But here, way up north, it's also jointly implemented, with success. After 40 years of Nordic cooperation on gender equality, we dare to say that the Nordic area is the most equal place on Earth.
Iceland gained independence from Denmark and became a parliamentary democracy in 1944.
Iceland separated from Denmark and regained full self-government.
The Conservative Independence Party became the strongest political force in the country and held the position of prime minister for almost 20 years. Under this party's leadership, policies that enforced gender inequity were widespread, especially in the workplace. By the 70s, women made up the majority of poorly paid, undervalued jobs, and were forced out of the labor market to work at home. In response to decades of conservative policies, a new women's group called the Red Stockings took radical steps to demand equal rights. Like when they crowned a cow at the Young Miss Iceland pageant to bring attention to unfair beauty standards, and crucified a doll dressed like a housewife to protest women's domestic labor, a founding member of the Red Stockings. This is the story of how Icelandic women shut down their country and changed it forever. So the Red Stockings, who weren't part of either group, couldn't act on their idea. Until 1975, when the United Nations kicked off
International Women's Year.
I would like to welcome you all to this really historic event.
This was the first global conference dedicated to women's issues.
Women form part of virtually every delegation.
And governments around the world planned events to address gender discrimination. In Iceland, the Prime Minister's office selected representatives from different women's associations across the country to make preparations. The committee was politically diverse. It included teachers, single mothers, conservatives, and liberals like the Red Stockings to make sure the event reflected the views of women across Iceland. The Red Stockings took this opportunity to propose that a women's strike against the gender pay gap was the best way to mark International Women's Year. The conservative women's associations found the idea far too radical, but the Red Stockings believed in the strike, so they pushed for one and slowly got some members on board. But overall, the committee was reluctant until they heard
a woman around 70. She was from a center political party from the old feminists. And she came to the podium and said, "Strike. Is that what you don't like?"
So that's what they did. The committee picked a day when women would collectively refuse to work at home and in the office to prove their economic value. And they called it a day off, or frænafrí. They only had 3 months to prepare. So the Red Stockings and the rest of the committee immediately mobilized multiple labor unions and women's organizations across the country to plan, fundraise, and spread the word about frænafrí.
The political party used their own platform to talk to their women. There were all kinds of women from diverse political and social groups, and
they wrote hundreds of letters to women across the country and called as many households as they could in Iceland's phone book to spread the word. They wrote articles, did radio interviews,
stefnt að því að konur út allt land verði þáttakendur í þessu kvennafríi,
designed flyers, and organized meetings late into the night to make sure that frænafrí was a success.
Some foolish enough to threaten women, threaten their employees, and that didn't go down well.
On October 24th, 1975, 90% of Icelandic women refused to work at home and in the office. An estimated 25,000 women took to the streets in Reykjavik alone to give speeches and sing about women's rights. There's even a vinyl of recorded songs sung by the Red Stockings from frænafrí. So many women refused to work that day that Iceland shut down. Without women, the telephone system crashed without switchboard operators, and newspapers couldn't publish without typesetters. The national airline canceled flights because there were no stewardesses, and preschools across the country shut down. Women's absence was felt in the home, too. Without domestic labor that Icelandic women carried out, there was no childcare, so men had to stay home or bring their children to work.
It was this cooperation across politics and classes and housewives and women working outside the home.
The impact of Fanafrí was felt across the country. After the day off, Iceland passed its first Gender Equality Act and officially banned wage discrimination on the basis of gender. Equal rights of women were added to the constitution, and women's representation in parliament rose too. In 1980, Iceland elected its first female leader and the world's first woman president to be elected democratically, something she insisted wouldn't have been possible without Fanafrí. No country in the world has completely closed its gender pay gap. Iceland still has some work to do too. But the country's quick progress is a sign that closing the gap is possible. Demonstrations like Fanafrí might not work in the same way in other countries, but its success shows us what happens when a country unites, politically and socially, to get closer to equality.
40 years of gender equality have paid off. But what about the future?
Women across Iceland have staged a 24-hour strike demanding gender equality. Now, it disrupted much of society, everything from schools to banks to public offices. Iceland is regarded as one of the world's most progressive countries in terms of gender equality. It has been the top performer on the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index 14 years in a row. Even the Prime Minister joined the protests today. But tens of thousands of women joined the Prime Minister in walking off the job for a full day, with many joining large demonstrations in the capital, Reykjavik, and in other towns. The walkout was billed as the biggest since Iceland's first such event in October of 1975. That's when 90% of Icelandic women refused to work or look after their children to voice anger at gender discrimination. A year later, Iceland passed a law guaranteeing equal gender rights.
I'm Katrín Jakobsdóttir. I'm the Prime Minister of Iceland. I think it's vital for every society to think on a broader scale than just from the economic terms. For a politician, it should be a primary goal to ensure that the population is happy, that they are doing well, and not just in economic terms, but also in social terms and environmental terms. We have implemented 39 indicators to measure really the well-being, and they are very closely connected also to the Sustainable Development Goals. If you measure things, you sometimes see new challenges that nobody was really talking about. I mentioned in my speech mental health. When we start to really put focus on measuring the mental health, we see really how big the challenge is. So it's not always that you really get some positive change immediately, and therefore it's so important to think long term. I could also mention the same can be said about gender-based violence. I have listened to some of my colleagues say that they don't have any issues concerning gender-based violence, but are they measuring it? So maybe the first step is often to measure it and acknowledge that there is a challenge, and then you can actually decide on an action. And I could also mention a positive action plan which we have seen really come into light when we decided to introduce shared parental leave in Iceland. And during the 2 decades which we have had that, we have actually seen a real change in the attitude of the population, both for men participating more in the upbringing of their children, but also of children having different views on the role of men and women because they grew up in that system. One of the big challenges is the fact that governments come and go, and this is change that needs to be, if we want to see the effects, it needs to be long term. So that's one of the things that, one of the big challenges is really that we who are in politics, we are often thinking short term because we have election ahead. So that is definitely a challenge, and therefore this conversation is very important. But then it's also very important to acknowledge that it takes time. You begin and you can say, you know, we implemented or started this process really in 2019. And I think we might see the changes, the positive changes in a few years' time, the first changes. And that's maybe, you know, politicians are impatient. and they want to see results. And that is maybe the biggest challenge for the well-being economy. You can't really see the change happen overnight. It takes time.